Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired Justice of the New York State Supreme Court. The 1964-65 World's Fair took place over 2 seasons, basically running in warm weather from April through October of each of those years. The whole thing was the creation, or actually under the supervision of Robert Moses, who was the czar of the World's Fair, and he was the unelected official in New York who was the subject of the very classic, famous book, The Power Broker by Robert Caro. The location of the fair was on Flushing Meadow Park, which originally was the 1939 site of the previous World's Fair in New York. And before that, it was a swamp, it was a dump, and it was known as the Ash Heap, and it's mentioned prominently in The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Well, the World's Fair had many kinds of pavilions. Some of them were federal, there were state pavilions, there were foreign pavilions, there were commercial pavilions, there were entertaining pavilions, all different kinds. And some of the best ones was the General Motors Pavilion, the General Electric Pavilion, Ford Motor Company had a very nice pavilion. The Vatican had a great pavilion, it was a big attraction. There was a Belgian Village, which was a recreation, which was a big attraction. It opened late because of construction difficulties. It started in August of 1964 rather than in April because of the delays. And certain countries had great pavilions. Spain had one that was very popular. Mexico had one that was very popular. New York State Pavilion was very popular. It's still there. They don't know what to do with it. There's 2 towers that are observation towers. One was a cafe, and then they had an exhibition space down below. Later on, they filmed the movie, the remake of The Wizard of Oz was called The Wiz, and it was filmed there, and it's still there now, and they're trying to do something with it. Also, they had the Texas Pavilion, which was very popular, and the Minnesota Pavilion, which had a logging show, and then they had the pavilion that was supposed to be the Louisiana Pavilion, but Louisiana, the state, backed out, and it became more or less of a private venture, and it was known as Bourbon Street, which was supposed to be a recreation of Bourbon Street in New Orleans. And it was a collection of about 2 blocks long, I guess 2 city blocks long, of clubs, little bistros, jazz clubs, etc., and different novelty and food concessions. And I worked at the corner of Bourbon Street was a place called The Bistro, which was a small open-air bar with a band. It had 2 bands, actually, and it was surrounded by wrought iron, so it was always open air. Even when it was closed, it was open air, but it was locked. There were locked gates, wrought iron gates. And it was right alongside a bridge, a pedestrian bridge, that took people over the Long Island Expressway from the main fairgrounds towards the Lake Area District. And right next to Bourbon Street was the Vatican Pavilion and the Belgian Village, which were very, very popular. We get huge crowds going across the bridge to the lake recreation area where there was a water show, and there was the Texas Pavilion, which was also popular. And there used to be huge crowds along the bridge to listen to the open-air music from the Bistro. Right across the street from the Bistro was another club. It was a 2-story proposition. I forget the exact name of it. It was Go-Go. Might have been Whiskey or Go-Go. I'm not sure. And downstairs was a big jazz club. It was a restaurant and a stage. And it was Cajun and New Orleans Creole type cuisine and jazz. And it was real jazz. They had traditional jazz. There was one guy, a trumpet player, Wingy Manone. He was a one-armed guy, so his nickname was Wingy. And he played traditional jazz. And then they had bebop and modern jazz by Maynard Ferguson and his band, which the bouncers hated, and they used to call him Barnyard. But it was all kinds of jazz downstairs. Upstairs was a rock and roll review. And the rock and roll review was emceed by a New York television personality and DJ by the name of Clay Cole, who was quietly a gay guy. He was a very, very nice man. And I used to go there on breaks. I had a girlfriend that was a dancer in the show. She used to dance at the Peppermint Lounge, and she danced in the rock and roll review with Clay Cole, and I would go see her. Her name was Marianne. I would see her on the break. I'd stop up and say hello, and it was always around the same time during the show, at which time Clay Cole would be singing listen, do you want to know a secret? The Beatles song, and he'd be looking at me and winking. It was kind of a joke between the two of us. He knew I was straight, but he was a good guy. He was a gentleman and a nice guy. A lot of fun. Well, the bistro, as I said, was a very, very popular place. And we had bouncers in the bistro. We had two bouncers, and there were bouncers all up and down the street in all the clubs because there was a lot of drinking going on and a lot of celebrating. And, you had different people from all over the world. So there's bound to be a little conflict here and there. And these guys, by coincidence, were all Italian American, all the bouncers on the street. There must have been 20 or 25 of them. They all were Italian American guys. And there was no coincidence. They all came from Greenwich Village. Also no coincidence. And I found out later they were all underlings in the Genovese crime family. And they were under the supervision of two cousins who were supposedly, I guess, we'd call them captains in the family. And they both had the same family name. And they were both called Joe. I guess they were named after their grandfather. That was the Italian custom. All the firstborn kids were named after their grandfather. So these two Joes, and they had the same last name. Let's say Joe Blow and Joe Blow. And they were both little guys, maybe about 4'8", 4'9". And they both had prominent noses. And to tell the difference, they had two different nicknames. And one was known as Joe the Jew. The other guy was known as Joe the Wop. I don't know why they called them that, but that's what they did, and that's how they differentiated between the two. I was hired. I had my band. I was the unofficial manager of a band called The Illusion. These were college friends of mine. And I was hired at the bistro to be the diplomatic bouncer because the guys from Greenwich Village, the regular bouncers, these guys were guerrillas, and their default right away was to tear somebody up. And the owner didn't want that unless it was absolutely necessary. So he hired me, and I would work the front door and try to persuade people to behave before the guerrillas could take over and wreak havoc on these people. So that was good. It was a good job. But it was a problem every night because there was a curfew imposed by Robert Moses, the head of the administration there. And he decreed that all the bars and restaurants would close at 2 a.m. as opposed to the regular New York law, which the curfew was 4 a.m. And people would come from out of town or even out of the country. And at 2 a.m., when we said last call, they would say, oh, come on, this is not last call. It's only 2 o'clock in the morning. There's 2 more hours to go. And you guys just want to get rid of us because we don't want to get rid of you. This is the rule. Oh, no, it's not. And sometimes it would lead to disagreement, which the regular bouncers loved because for them it was just a workout. They couldn't wait for 2 o'clock in the morning to start bouncing people around. I, on the other hand, could. But from time to time, we would have some all-out brawls in there. And I would partake in, just out of self-defense. You had to do it. And my friend Mickey, who was the drummer in the band that I managed, Mickey was a flower child. He had long hair like a beetle and everything else. But all of a sudden, when a fight broke out, he'd jump over the drums and forget his flower child persona and revert to his Hell's Kitchen Irish Docks persona and start pounding people. But we had a lot of fun. And thankfully, it wasn't too many of those incidents, but just enough. And the different characters there was spectacular. One guy, I call him the world's oldest juvenile delinquent. He was from Bleecker Street in the village. His nickname was Rocky Eggs. And he couldn't wait to fight every night. And he looked like a little guy, looked like an owl, but he loved to fight. Another guy, I don't even remember his name, but his claim to fame was he knocked out who he called Willie Pastrami in a bar brawl in the village. But Willie Pastrami was actually Willie Pastrano, was the light heavyweight champion of the world, a guy who happened to be from New Orleans, by the way. But this guy, his claim to fame was he knocked out Willie Pastrami. And these guys were outrageous, but you had to be careful with them. And I tried to be as diplomatic as I could with the people to spare them. On breaks from the bistro, I would go right next door. The Vatican was a beautiful pavilion, and when it wasn't too crowded, I would go in there and just stick my head in. There was the Pietà, the statue of the body of Christ with the Blessed Mother that was so famous. And that was the biggest attraction in the World's Fair. That was spectacular. And the Belgian Village was right next door, and I would stop there, and they would sell Belgian waffles. And one of the waffle concerns was owned by a famous guy from Jimmy Breslin's writings in his columns in the daily newspapers, a bookmaker, an Irish-American guy called Fat Thomas. I don't know, Thomas and I became friends, and he, I don't know how he got the concession, but he was doing pretty well selling Belgian waffles there. And also right next door was the New York State Pavilion, which had the towers, and I would go up there for a smoke, which was really impressive because you could see the entire layout of the entire fairgrounds. It was really, really special to go up there. And another character I met there was a woman by the name of Helen Meyer. Helen was an artist. She was from Greenwich Village, and she painted murals in restaurants and nightclubs. And they were beautiful. She'd paint Italian scenes, Greek scenes, French scenes, street scenes. And she made a living painting murals in all of the clubs and restaurants on Bourbon Street. And Helen, she had a big, big crown of jet black hair, and she was oversized. She was, we would say, zaftig or buxom. She had big shoulders. She had a big bust. She had big muscular calves, and but she was shapely. It was all in proportion, and she was quite a stunning person. She looked very brassy and very bold, but she was anything but. She was actually very subdued and demure as a person, a personality which her appearance belied. And she looked like, if anyone would be familiar, there's an illustrator called Frazetta, and Frazetta's a famous artist. He did a lot of paintings, like comic book illustrations of medieval or Viking or Stone Age women who are these heroic figures with swords and waving swords and spears and arrows and everything else. And they're all oversized, but they're kind of very sexy and very pretty in their own way. And that was Helen. And Helen and I became good friends. It was nice to be able to talk to somebody with some intelligence down there. And I met her. She invited me. She said, "Come to Greenwich Village where I live. I wanted you to come to the club. It's called Page 3. And I want to introduce you to the guy that's performing there. You're going to enjoy this." So I did on an off night. And I went to Page 3. And it turns out Helen's friend, a woman named Jackie, owned Page 3. And it was a lesbian bar, which didn't bother me in the least. And downstairs they had a performance space. And the performer was introduced to me after the show by Helen, and his name was Tim, and he had two shopping bags, and he came over and said, "Oh, Mr. Rudy, it's so nice to meet you. Helen said so many nice things. I hope you enjoyed the show," etc., etc. Turns out it was Tiny Tim, but this was 2 years before he appeared on the Johnny Carson show on Tonight Show and made a big name for himself. He was delightful. He was a great entertainer. He was quite a good guy. And the band I alluded to before was The Illusion, and these were my college friends. There were four guys. A guy named Charlie Callahan was the lead guitar. Charlie went on to become a leading child psychologist and author and a college professor. Another guy named Jack Murphy was a bass player. We used to call him Jaguar Jack because he played a Fender Jaguar bass. And Jack went on to be a music executive. He spent all his life in music. He had a band for some time called J.F. Murphy and Free Flowing Salt that opened on the world tour for the Mothers of Invention, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. And he played the Fillmore East, the Fillmore West. Jack did very, very well. And he later wrote a somewhat successful, modestly successful Broadway show, a musical called The Civil War. Then there was another fellow, Tony, and I'm sorry, I don't remember Tony's last name at this point, but Tony went on to a career in the postal service, in the post office. And of course, my friend, who was my best college friend, Mickey Earl, who was the drummer, who was the flower child who would get into a street fight at the drop of a hat. And these guys were a cover band, and they would play, they were like the English Invasion cover band. They could play the Beatles, the Dave Clark Five, the Animals, Jerry and the Pacemakers, any of those British bands. And if you listened from a distance and you didn't watch, you thought you were listening to a jukebox. They had it down to a science, and they were great. And it was a big thing at that time. It was just coming in, and it was very, very popular. And it was a good contrast with the other band that worked in the bistro. And these were a group of four black guys from Midwest. I think they were from Ohio. I'm not sure. Called Carl Holmes and the Commanders. And they had a bass player named Chico, who was probably the best bass player I've ever heard in my life. But Carl Holmes and the Commanders, nobody knew them by that name, but they were the backup band for Chubby Checker on all his famous records that were big, big international sellers, The Twist and Let's Twist Again and Twist in USA and all of this sort of stuff. They were just phenomenal, and they were great, and they were great guys. And another musician I befriended was a very genteel guy named Leon Atkinson, who was a guitarist. And he was the guitarist. He was playing on Bourbon Street there, but he had been the guitarist for the worldwide tour with Nina Simone. which was no small feat because Nina Simone, first of all, is a consummate artist, but she's also a raging diva, and she's very, very difficult to work with because of her temperament. And Leon was a total sweetheart, and he made it through the whole world tour, and Nina really was very fond of Leon because he was such an easygoing guy, but he was a great musician. Well, one particular incident, I alluded to the fact that there were some fights there on occasion. One night, I was on a break and I went across the street to the jazz club, and I'm having espresso with one of the two captains there, aka Joe the Jew. And he's a little guy. He looks like Jimmy Durante, and he's about 4'8", maybe in his best day. He's got electric blue slacks and a black sport shirt and a houndstooth sport jacket and a straw hat, like a straw Panama hat. And we're having coffee. And all of a sudden, there's a disturbance in the place near the bar. And there's this guy, and I recognize him as Big Henry. He was a regular customer in the place. And Big Henry, he's the star of the show at the Minnesota Pavilion. He was in a logging show where he portrayed Paul Bunyan, the legendary logger. And he was almost 7 feet tall. And there was Henry cradling an adult on his hip, like you see pictures of mothers carrying an infant in diapers on their hip. He was carrying a full-grown adult on his hip with his left hand and swatting him with his right hand. The bouncers were trying to restrain him, and he looked like a Hercules movie. He would just wave his arm, and 3 bouncers would go flying. Nobody could stop this guy. And little Joe, the old man, he says, "This guy's wrecking my joint. I'll tear him apart." He gets up, and he's not going to tear this guy apart. He's not even up to the guy's knees. And if he gets hurt, I'm going to have to answer for it. So I pushed Joe back in his chair. I ran to the bar, and I picked up a bar stool, and it was padded. The stool was padded, which was good. I got behind Henry, and I hit him right between the shoulder blades. I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted to get his attention, have him stop and stun him. And that worked. And he stopped. He dropped the guy, and the bouncers surrounded him and restrained him. I just said, "Good night. See you tomorrow. I wasn't here today. Remember, I wasn't here. Forget about it." And I walked out. And I came back the next night, and I found out what really happened. And what really happened was that Henry had befriended, over the months that he was working there, Joey the bartender. And the guy he was swatting like a baby had insulted Joey and tried to start a fight with Joe. And Henry was defending him. He was actually trying to do something good, but who knew? Anyway, no harm came of it. And that's the time I dropped the 7-foot guy. That's the end of it. And then one other notable experience was the visit of Pope Paul VI, who came to the Vatican Pavilion and made an appearance with the Pietà. And I never saw so many policemen in my life, before, then, or since. There was an ocean of blue uniforms around the Vatican Pavilion, and this was only 100 yards away from Bourbon Street. And I was on a break, and I decided, let me see if I can get close and actually see the Pope. So I'm having a cigarette, and I went my way through the crowd, and I ended up 2 feet from the Pope. I could have hit him in the head with a meatball hero if I wanted to. And the thought struck me that with all that security, if anybody was willing to die, there was no security. All that security meant nothing if somebody was ready to give up their life, because they could do whatever they had to do and then, offer up their lives in the process. And it was a real revelation. In any event, what I saw on Bourbon Street in the 1964 and 65 World's Fair, what I saw was far more spectacular and interesting and varied than all the sights that all the tourists saw over the 2 seasons that the place succeeded. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.